enough. You're not him, the Mandarin, the real guy. Where? Where's the Mandarin? Where is it?
Whoa. He's here. He's here, but he's not here. He's here, but he's not here.
What do you mean?
It's complicated. Hey, it's complicated,
It
right?
is.
It's complicated.
Uncomplicated. Ladies out. Get out of the bed. Get in the bathroom. Sit.
Oh, Jesus.
My name's Trevor Slattery.
What are you? What are you, decoy? You're a double, right?
What, I mean, like an understudy? No, absolutely not. Don't hurt the face. I'm an actor.
You got a minute to live. Fill it with words.
Just a role. The Mandarin. See, it's not real.
Then how did you get here, Trevor?
Well, I had a little problem with substances, and I ended up doing things, no two ways about it, in the street that a man shouldn't do.
Next.
And then they approached me about the role, and they knew about the drugs.
What did they say? They'd get you off them?
Said they'd give me more. They gave me things. They gave me this palace. They gave me plastic surgery. They gave me things.
Did you just nod off? Hey.
No, on a lovely speedboat. And the thing was, he needed someone to take credit for some accidental explosions.
He? Killian?
Killian.
He created you.
He created me.
Custom-made terror threat.
Yes. His think tank thinked it up.
The pathology of a serial killer. The manipulation of Western iconography. Ready for another lesson?
Blah, blah, blah. Of course, it was my performance brought the Mandarin to life.
Your performance? Where people died?
No, they didn't. Look around you, the costumes, green screen. Honestly, I wasn't on location for half of this stuff. When I was, it was movie magic love.
I'm sorry, but I got a best friend who's in a coma and he might not wake up. So you're gonna have to answer for that. You're still going down, pal.
Okay, Trevor. What'd you tell him?
I didn't tell him anything.
Nothing.
No.
Should have pressed the panic button.
Well, I panicked, but then I handled it.
Welcome to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and I just got an email about a week or so ago with a pretty interesting request, and it looks like we're getting slightly more academic than our usual episodes today, and we've got two of those academics here, and that's Sai Islam and Gordon Schmidt. How are you guys doing today?
Doing great.
Doing great.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm glad you guys emailed me. It was completely surprising because pretty much everybody I've had on the show is someone I've had some interaction before. So this is the first time I've gotten something completely different. So it's a really interesting opportunity, I thought. But before we jump into the movie, why don't you guys talk a little bit about yourselves? Sai, why don't you go first?
Sure. So I'm an associate professor of industrial organizational psychology at Farmingdale State College in Long Island, New York. I'm also a consultant on the side. So for those who don't know, industrial organizational psychology is the study of psychology at work. So any sort of experiences that you might have at work, that's something that IO psychologists might research and study. And one of the areas that Gordon and I have an interest in is leadership. And that's part of what our book is about. So I'll hand things off to Gordon to continue.
Yeah, hi, I'm Gordon Schmidt. I'm an associate professor of organizational leadership at Purdue Fort Wayne in Indiana. My PhD is in organizational psychology. So Sai and I are in the same branch of psychology that focuses on the workplace. I do research on a whole bunch of different areas. The future of work is a big area, technology's effect on the workplace. A big area is leadership. And so sort of out of that interest in leadership and this book series exploring leadership practices through pop culture, Sai and I saw a call for these books ideas and we're like, hey, Marvel would be great for this. There's so many great examples of leadership, both good and bad. And so we thankfully they accepted our pitch for a book, and we've got that book coming up. June 7th is coming out by Emerald Publishing. And so it looks at all of the aspects of how Marvel movies help us to learn about leadership concepts that are empirically supported and based on the existing research that's out there, so that people can be better leaders and all that. So that's the big picture of that.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting. And I got it. You guys gave me the chapter to read on Tony Stark, which because today we're going to be talking about Iron Man 3, which we'll get to in a minute. But I want to let you guys talk a little bit more about the book at first. So you said it was this series about leadership in pop culture. What made you guys think about the MCU? Like, did one of you have the idea and pitch it to the other, or how did it all kind of come together?
So that sounds more like who's to blame for this whole thing, which I think is Gordon. I think you and I were talking about it, right? And you saw the call, and then he was like, "Hey, we should Marvel. We talk about Marvel all the time." And just to go into our nerd bona fides a little bit, we don't just talk about like the movies. So Gordon and I will sometimes talk about the old school Avengers issues, because he's doing like a reread. And we'll talk about how silly some of these things are, or about like Mysterio popping up in Spider-Man, and he says he's hated Spider-Man for years, but he was he'd only shown up the year before.
He's been plotting his revenge for years. He appeared in issue 13, first appearance, and this is issue 24. Not even a year. Like, we talk about comic book time where people are in, high school for 40 years.
Right.
This is like accelerated time. I don't know. Like, Peter should be graduated already based on this line.
They've always had that
4 years.
They've always had that weird thing in comics aging where Franklin Richards is a kid for 50 years, but then teenage heroes are adults who premiered a lot later than he did.
Yeah, it's crazy on that. Yeah, the timeline of those old issues of Stan Lee and Ditko are like crazy. Yeah, because Dr. Octopus gets out of jail he served his time within a year, I guess.
Yeah,
and they don't take their weapons. The Beetle gets out of prison in a recent episode that I read. I don't know, it's in the 20s, and they're like, "Well, we got to give you your super suit as part of your crime, but we can't keep it from you. There's nothing wrong with you using your criminal." I don't think they really understand how the police work and confiscating stuff. The Beetle's like, "I'm going to commit crime right away." They're like, "Well, I guess do it. We can't take the Beetle suit from you." It's a very ugly Beetle suit at that time. It looks a lot better nowadays.
Oh, is that the one with the suction cup fingers?
Yeah, suction. Yeah. It's funny. So many of the Ditko designs and stuff in there look so good. But the Beetle, I think he came from a different series, and like,
well, being something of an artist myself, like after a point, you kind of just start getting like, you kind of run out of ideas.
Oh yeah, well, it's what you get used to too.
Yeah,
we're used to certain things on these characters, and they all look weird. That's like the Avengers reread I'm doing. Like, everyone just looks off model a little bit of the villains. You're like, why did you do that?
Yeah,
the Grim Reaper wears like 7 colors that are all bright in his costume, which is just, it's a horrible look for the Grim Reaper.
Yeah, for the kids. Yeah, it's still for the kids, Gordon. We need it to be multicolored. You can't have
Grim Reaper
wear all black.
Yeah, I understand.
But it's interesting because one of the interesting parts about Marvel Cinematic Universe is that it's taken over pop culture in a way. And that's part of the reason that Gordon and I really thought that this would be a great vehicle to explain leadership theory. Because one of the things we saw in our teaching and in our consulting work was that there were a lot of ideas out there, and a lot of them about leadership are like not great and not rooted in the science. And so this becomes a really great way for us to talk about examples that people can relate to. So especially for college students, I don't know what it's like where you're teaching now, Perry, but for us, not every student is going to understand like a political example or like a military example or other examples, but a lot of them get Marvel Cinematic Universe examples. So they'll understand, Captain America is a servant leader. He gives of himself and is willing to sacrifice himself for others. They understand that Tony Stark is, a certain type of leader, right? And he's kind of searching for something in his leadership skill set, right? So, I think that it works well with students, and they really seem to understand and get the concepts more easily than some of the other examples that we usually use in class. They're also like easy references in terms of clips, things like that. So I think that it was like a really easy transition for us to kind of think through that process.
Yeah, and Cy and I both use pop culture in our classes to illustrate stuff already. So this book, to some degree, seemed like a nice extension of that idea. As we're already talking about some of this stuff. Like when the Avengers, I think, came to DVD, we did an Avenger movie event on campus, and we talked about leadership concepts. And so they're all kind of these things where it was a really good fit of saying, well, how could we make this book and make it really do a well of teaching these leadership concepts through these movies that we love. We love the comics, we grew up with them. And these movies that are so popular and have so many interesting things. There's so many strong characters as well, where we've got people in conflict, we've got people with very different perspectives coming together. And we love that about all the Marvel stuff, the MCU stuff anyways. And so it's really cool to kind of analyze that and sort of this our field we love and all these concepts, make them more understandable. At least that's the goal.
That's really cool. And I like a lot of what I'm hearing here. And going back to something you said, Cy, here in Japan, I think it's probably even more extreme as far as people not getting students not being able to get like the political examples or anything like that. As people, youth in Japan especially seem to be very disconnected from political, socio-political type stuff in general. And they we do one of my classes, we read a book of essays, and one of the essays, and it's written by an American who has lived in Japan for a long time. Not me, but he is a friend of mine. But he, in his book, one of the essays is talking about, being involved with politics, when you're living in another country, and being involved in the politics from your home country when you're living in another country. And he talks about, and one of the questions I ask about my students is, and I bring up this idea that youth in Japan are so politically disengaged and are pretty apathetic, and I ask them what they think about that idea. And almost universally, I'd say like 90% of the students say, I don't pay attention to politics. And so yeah, it's and so when I do teach these ideas in some, like I do teach a film class, and I use a lot of like Japanese film to help teach them about history, about different political aspects of Japanese society. And it really, I think you guys have found this as well, which is probably use it. It really helps illustrate it. It helps make it easier for them to understand these concepts when you present it through that kind of lens.
Yeah, and that's something like for us when we talk about psychology in the workplace, it's already kind of a barrier, because usually when people think about psychology, they tend to only think about it in a clinical setting, a mental health setting. But for us, we're looking at psychology in the workplace, how people kind of communicate with each other, how they deal with one another. And leadership kind of falls very easily into that, into understanding what makes a leader, in understanding what a leader does. And there's a lot of great research on the topic. And we'd love for students to be able to engage with it in a way that's a little bit deeper than, here's this textbook, enjoy it, and then, just memorize it and take my test.
Yeah. And something else too, you guys talked about how there's a lot of stuff out there that's not rooted in the science. And like, especially for me personally, I had no idea there was even a scientific aspect to this field, because there are so many charlatans in this kind of field. So I think it's really cool that not only do you have a science-based approach, but you're using it in a way that makes it easy for people to understand. I think that's a really cool way of doing it.
We get into that a little bit in the first chapter in the intro to kind of give our perspective, because I think it's very true with leadership in these areas that we have sort of misconceptions. So there's a lot of ideas of, people are born as leaders, that you've just got sort of like CEOs are the only people that are really leaders and this type of thing. And so our perspective really is everybody can be a leader, and everybody engages in leadership by influencing other people. We do it all the time, but we don't really see it that type of way. And so much of, how we learn about leadership in public is about, famous CEOs of the past, and they were successful, so therefore we should be like them. So things like leadership quotes and all this.
Right.
Most of those quotes aren't even by the correct person, mind you. But
the problem with
it's
quotes on the internet is that you can't judge their veracity, is what Abraham Lincoln apparently said according to Twitter.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there's definitely this disconnect between sort of the science and the knowledge and sort of this gloop of leadership examples and stuff out there that's not really connected to anything. And so the book takes that pop culture that's appealing and puts the actual science into it, uses it that way. And I think that hopefully helps people to learn the material versus just kind of just go with whatever they happen to hear out there, or the meme that somebody shared. So
who would you guys, I'm not sure if you guys actually get into this in your book, because judging from the chapter I read, it seems like you're just kind of using different examples, but who would you say is the best leader in the MCU and who would be the worst?
Okay, so this is a dangerous topic, because Gordon and I actually talked a lot about this, and I think we have different favorites, depending on who we think is kind of best at any given time. But I will say, Gordon and I discovered something interesting as we were looking at the book. So before we give our favorites, I do want to mention something. So there's a part of the MCU where we don't see a lot of leadership, and that's with Black Widow. And I think, Gordon, you were the one to first point this out, that she leads the Avengers during the blip, right? And, we don't see it, but she must have done a great job to keep the Avengers going.
Yeah, you've got 5 years of which half the people are missing from the world, the biggest crisis possible. And we see at the end of that period, Black Widow is like the one leading everything. And frankly, the world seems in pretty good shape considering, right?
Yeah.
It's like, it seems like it's functioning. People aren't happy. Some people have PTSD. A lot of the heroes are suffering trauma, as you'd expect. But we at least kind of really feel that probably she did a pretty good job during this.
Well, one of the interesting things about that scene in Endgame is it feels like the Avengers are more on top of things than they ever have been before, because, she's got them monitoring things, not only in different parts of the world, but she's also got, Captain Marvel and Rocket off in space monitoring stuff.
Yeah, because a lot of these people weren't connected, right? They weren't connected. They weren't doing stuff together. But the blip has kind of, and with Black Widow in this leadership role, has kind of gotten all this stuff well connected. And it seems like they're doing pretty good in the situation. It also is, we've got a chapter on women in leadership, and it's kind of like all of the male leaders left. And so finally Black Widow gets a shot to lead, right? And if we look at sort of the group of leaders at that time, we've got multiple female leaders that are there that are part of this sort of meeting, right? I think, I can't remember all the heads that are there, but we got War Machine, we've got, somebody from Wakanda, we've got basically women in charge of all this stuff.
Right.
What happens once Ant-Man comes up with an idea to save everything? Well, all the white dudes come back, right? Iron Man.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Cap comes back, and suddenly Black Widow's back to being, she's a spy person on the side. She gets to die, so Hawkeye can have an MCU series, TV series. It's just really, it's really interesting and really sad to some degree, because I feel like she did a good job that we've never seen.
Yeah, I've said that, I've maintained that. Two ideas I'd have for either an MCU tie-in comic or an animated series would be, one would be what happened to Cap in this other timeline that he lived to be an old man in. Oh, yeah. And the other is, what happened in those 5 years? What were the Avengers getting up to in those 5 years? I think there's so much story potential that you could mine.
Yeah, and we only get just a taste. The Falcon and Winter Soldier kind of shows some of the impact of when people come back and this displacement and this trauma, but really we just kind of move on because we got a movie, we've got to end this phase of the MCU, we got to beat Thanos. But it seems like a really interesting world to really get into. In the comics, it was a pretty short period of time. Nobody remembers anything really.
It wasn't even it was maybe a week at most or something.
That's how it feels in the comics, at least, right? I don't know. I don't have the exact Marvel official timeline, but it doesn't seem long, and there doesn't seem to be anybody's affected. They're well, crossover's done. Maybe some future Silver Surfer comics will talk about this, The rest
Yeah.
of us are done until this is too popular and we have to fight, I guess we have to fight, the goddess or whatever because they were popular enough. It's just wild.
Yeah, for sure. I do think, yeah, it's interesting that's like the one time period that I think Gordon and I are really excited to like hear about and see. And it's I don't know if they're going to be able to bring a big enough truckload of money to ScarJo to get her to make that 5-year like Disney Plus series. So back to your original question, Perry. I think the leader that I would say is maybe the best. This might show my personal bias because I love the character so much. Is probably T'Challa, probably the Black Panther. I think he's got this right balance of kind of some military expertise, some like scientific knowledge, and he's also, out of all the leaders in the MCU, he's the one who's able to turn an enemy into an ally in M'Baku, and I think that really means something. Especially in the MCU, where we think of conflict, especially in comic book movies, where conflict between hero and villain usually ends in death. He even offers to Killmonger at the end. He tells him like, "Hey, I'll save you. I can still save you. Just tell me, give me the go ahead." And he's willing to forgive. And I think that's a really powerful lesson, and a really important lesson for leaders, is figuring out a way to like work together, and kind of manage things through crises. And I think Black Panther really touches on all of that.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. Gordon, do you have a different one, or?
So I think if we're just looking at objectively best leader, I do think T'Challa does a great job of sort of getting people on his side, of really dealing with, despite being in theory kind of a new leader. He's already had impact, but was not the top guy. He certainly seems like he's been developed. I think it's interesting with teams like who makes a good leader. So somebody like Star-Lord with the Guardians of the Galaxy, you might not think of him as a leader in a traditional sense, or somebody that like, everybody does what he says, but that's just such a crazy team of different personalities and people with different experiences and different skills. He does a good job of like staying out of the way when that's the right thing. So when like Rocket's like, this is how we're going to escape from prison, a bad leader, but a very common leader would be like, I'm the leader, not this weird raccoon, right? I know what's going on. But Rocket is the right person for that job. And I think that that's a nice thing. And we talked about in the book with shared leadership and Guardians, is everybody kind of has points where they're sort of in charge, or they're the one you listen to a lot more. And that can be a great way to sort of do that leadership as it goes. Obviously with the Avengers, I think Captain America is a very good field commander. He does a good job of saying, okay, you do this, you do that, and present it in a way that people do it. The first Avengers movie, I think, does a good sort of job as the aliens are coming down. He's like, okay, the Hulk should do this, and Black Widow do this, and Hawkeye, call somebody on the phone and tell them what they should be doing. Whatever it is that each person is supposed to do. And I don't think Tony Stark is the best leader, but his growth and development, and we can certainly talk about that with the movies, to me, is very interesting. I don't think at any moment he's the best, but he does seem to really develop and work and figure out who he is, which I think is really helpful.
Something you said in there really made me think about Star-Lord and how he's got this very kind of chaotic kind of leadership style, which works for the Guardians, but it wouldn't work with probably any other team. And I think Infinity War does a good job of kind of illustrating this, when Tony is trying to make the plan and you've got Drax yawning and not paying attention. And you kind of see it in Tony's face when he realizes, two things. I think, like, one thing I think is like, he's thinking like, I got in a fight with Captain America, and this is my consolation prize. But the other thing I think is like, how the hell am I supposed to get these misfits to work together? And so like that kind of leadership style would work for the Avengers, but he does, when he's put in this situation with the Guardians, he's got no idea how to bring them together.
Yeah, and we see that, we talk about in leadership, some of the basic breakdown of leadership behaviors is relationship behaviors and task behaviors. And what complicates that as well is not only, so relationship is, we're all connected, we like each other, we have a good working relationship. So you need to build some of those things. Otherwise, people don't want to still be part of it. They don't trust each other, stuff like that. Task behaviors is more about doing the things. So beating Thanos, organizing what we're going to do to beat these aliens. That's the task behaviors. What's kind of interesting, and I'm teaching a course on diversity management this semester, and so I've been thinking about it a lot more, but there's also the very big differences between the groups and teams, right? As we talked about with the Guardians versus the Avengers. Is a good task behavior in one place, like Tony's method might work for the Avengers, but it may not really work for the Guardians. It may not work for other groups. It's just not a good fit for what's going on.
Right.
And I think we see that sometimes with sort of the X-Men, which it'll be exciting when they're in the MCU. But a lot of the X-Men movie and some of the comics, and the early comics are like this. Professor X is like, I'm your teacher, you listen to me and obey. And people are like, yes, Professor X. Now, some of the comics suggest, he was affecting people's minds a little bit. Maybe that's why they listened so well. But just thinking about going to the Guardians or the Avengers with that version of Professor X, like that dude ain't the leader for long.
Yeah.
It's how I feel, right? And you need people like Wolverine to push back a little bit. Otherwise, it's just, everybody's the good student that wants to get an A. That's probably part of the reason the Avengers or the X-Men took a while to get popular. Is it's a weird like we're in school learning to be mutants and happen to fight the Blob sometimes. Which doesn't really gel to my mind, at least.
I was also thinking of in the early Defenders issue, like back in the Steve oh god, I'm blanking on his name, and I'm gonna feel like an idiot when I remember it. But he did this great run on Defenders, and it was very much like the ultimate misfit team. And it's like Doctor Strange with the Hulk, but he's got like a very childlike mentality, and it's like all these completely disparate personalities. And you just imagine that off panel, Doctor Strange is off having throwing back a few scotches or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think one interesting thing that we're noticing as well is leaders' perceptions of their situation really do impact like how they handle these situations. So Tony Stark is used to like the best of everything, right? And he's just sort of like, what is this mishmash of random people that showed up to be a part of this team? Whereas Star-Lord, that's what he does all the time. He's just like picking up a family, picking up friends, and saying like, hey, let's get together, let's work on this. And so sometimes one of the things we talk a little bit about in the book is like being open to things as a leader and being kind of adaptable. And sometimes if you're too used to coming from money and being able to like order things and get things done the way that you always want, that can get in the way of your own leadership capabilities.
Yeah, that's a good point. Tony's always used to, and I think, like in Infinity War, when Doctor Strange says, unlike everybody in your life, I don't work for you, where I don't think there's ever been a situation where Tony wasn't employing everybody who's taking orders from him in some form. Even when he was with the Avengers, it was his money that was funding the team.
Yeah, and he says that at times. We talk about that some in our conflict chapter, where he's like, I'm paying, I should make the decision. Cap doesn't necessarily accept that argument, but he always feels that way with a lot of those teams.
Yeah. What about worst leader? Do either of you have a nomination for worst leader in the MCU?
This might be too easy, but I would say Drax. Drax cannot concentrate enough to possibly lead anything. So, I think that he probably is not built for leadership on any level. I actually think Groot might be able to lead more effectively than Drax.
I think that's a good point. Yeah, I think he probably would be able to. Gordon, how about you?
I think there's also a question of experience and what you think you can do. And so to me, the MCU Spider-Man is really to the teen who, is sort of neurotic and kind of like, ooh, I get to meet Tony Stark. That's cool. And so I think at least in a lot of his time in, the main MCU, he can't be a leader because he's sort of this kid with these adults. And I think I actually really like that Spider-Man version. Growing up and reading comics in the early 90s and stuff, we already had like Spider-Man's a dude married to a supermodel with a successful photograph book called Webs or all this stuff. So I kind of grew up with like adult Spider-Man, but like teen Spider-Man to me is the best Spider-Man. And watching him, enact the MCU and with Tony Stark, you're just like, that kid's kind of annoying. And I understand completely why you would be if you were Peter Parker. You're a team. You're a quipster. You're super smart and kind of awkward. This is how you would behave. People would be like, Spider-Man, he's great to team up with. You're like, that kid, he's pretty annoying. He's so annoying to deal with, but he's helpful. As Peter gets more experience and stuff, we see him in a leader and stuff in the comics, but is like sort of that teenage kid. He doesn't necessarily have the respect of others enough for them to see him as somebody that could lead. And so I think it'd be very hard for him to be successful with where he's at in the MCU generally. That's my feeling, at least.
It's interesting in No Way Home, right? The different versions of Peter are maybe the Garfield version of Peter is a little bit better of a leader. He might be the best leader out of that trio, right? Like teen Spidey with Tom Holland, not ready to lead. I felt like I don't know, Perry, you saw No Way Home?
Oh yeah,
right?
yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I feel like Toby's Peter was a little too laid back and quiet, but maybe Andrew Garfield, Peter could actually lead because he's on that maturity scale.
I think No Way Home, I thought, did wonders for. I was always a proponent of Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man. We did a pair of episodes covering his movies not too long back, but he had a really good take on Spider-Man, especially his Peter Parker. I think I kind of maintain that he's a little bit too charming and a little bit too cool to be Peter Parker, I think. But I think in No Way Home, it really gave him like a second win, and really made me wish we could have seen what he would have been able to do with a better script.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, if we go a little bit off MCU, like the Spider-Verse, into the Spider-Verse, it's kind of interesting to see all the different Spider-Mans, and we don't have a big leader flashing lights. We've got sort of peers working together, and sort of if we look at them as a team or as sort of this peer mentoring, they work with each other, but there's not any of those. Even the more experienced Spider-Men are not like, oh, this guy's a leader, this is who you'd pick for it. It's like we're all kind of working together, and we've got a shared vision of the world, seeing all their origins playing out, even with Spider-Ham, of being, we've got a similar origin, and so we have a similar perspective, even though we're all over the place in terms of our realities. But it's interesting that none of them seem like this is the leadership version. This is the CEO version of Peter Parker.
Well, yeah, because the leadership guy got killed off right in the first 10 minutes.
He does.
Yeah, he gets killed off right away. So I don't know. Maybe he would have been a great leader, but he don't make it.
Well, we do get his version of the Jingle Bell, the Spider-Man Jingle Bells tune. So that's the most important part of leadership, actually.
Oh, definitely.
You get a great jingle.
So before we jump into the movie, one other question, because you guys had both mentioned that you had kind of grown up a little bit with comic books. So what is kind of how did you get into comic books in the first place?
So the way I got into comic books is my brother gave me his big box of 70s and 80s comics. And the first comic I think I ever read was Mighty Thor 138 with the Gray Gargoyle. And I thought it was okay. And then I started reading a bunch of like Fantastic Four and a lot of Spider-Man. I got into Black Panther because I bought a bunch of old Jack Kirby issues from a flea market at a church near my house. And I was like, wow, these are great. And then my parents would like reward me if I got good grades. They'd be like, okay, let's go to the comic book store. You can pick some stuff out. And so I really got into it, and still read comics now, and it's loads of fun. So yeah, it's not much of an origin story, but it's just for a nerdy kid in New Jersey, that's kind of how I got hooked.
Gordon, how about you?
Yeah, so my dad was a comic fan in the late 50s and 60s. But not of superheroes. He liked war. He liked cowboys. I've got what is it? Adult Amazing Fantasy 11, and I'm just like, if you just got it's got its Steve Ditko like weird monster type thing. And I'm like, man, could you just went a little bit later And I remember reading as a kid one of his issues, and like there's a house ad for like Avengers whatever with the first appearance of Baron Zemo. I'm like, why don't we have these comics? We've got the first appearance of the Ice Cream Soldier and Sergeant Rock or something, right? Complete. So like, so as I was, a kid in elementary school, I had read his comics, but I got into stuff like G.I. Joe and He-Man and this stuff that I'd watched. And we started going to some comic shops and buying those, which is a great time to get them in discount bins because they weren't as popular. Them and Transformers and all this. And then we had went to this flea market near our house, the Fireman's Flea Market. And my dad was always interested in buying stuff and selling it for a profit at the garage sale. And so he bought this big box there of comics. And so it's a bunch of 70s and 80s, like Marvel comics and some DC. And so out of that box, and my dad's like, oh, you can keep some of the comics too. We'll sell some at the garage sale. So I read a bunch of stuff. Before the garage sale, already the Spider-Man were mine. I took them. They're in the 130s and 140s in that. I was like, Spider-Man's cool. And that's really how I got to know him. And then during the garage sale itself, I was like, those Avengers books were really kind of fun. I want to keep them. So somebody bought one of the Avengers issues at the garage sale. I was like, oh no, Avengers 286. I read it just that one time when I was, in fourth grade or whatever. And so that was really what got me into the superheroes. Like I had all these like toy property comics I'd gotten. We'd gotten a lot of them in, the quarter bins and stuff. But then we ended up going to the stores, and this was an era where a lot of the Avengers books weren't doing particularly well in sales. The Roger Stern era, I think, is great. Those books were awesome, but they weren't, the X-Men were popular, right? Other Spider-Man was popular. And so I got a lot of Avengers from those cheap bins. I subscribed to Amazing Spider-Man in the early 90s, got the first appearance of Carnage sent to me in the mail from Marvel and that subscription. And so that got me really hooked. And so those Avengers from the cheap bins and Spider-Man as it was coming out were kind of my big intro into that world of Marvel comics. Then as I got older, I expanded into more stuff and found out what DC was really. I knew those characters some, but they weren't as appealing as a kid. And so that's kind of how I got involved in all of that. And Si and I are both those old fans that were like, maybe they'll make a good movie someday of this type of thing. We're just waiting for something that's actually going to be okay. And so something like the first X-Men movies just being like a revelation. They were they're good. And we do a chapter on X-Men, those X-Men movies in the book, going a little off the MCU, and just watching X-Men again and being like, oh man, Hugh Jackman is great as Wolverine, and Anna Paquin as Rogue is pretty appealing. Like the first movie with X-Men, when I watched it again, I was like, this might suck a lot. It's possible, because at the time, like the standard was so low that just the fact it wasn't really bad was like amazing. And I feel that way as well, honestly, about Iron Man. We're just getting Iron Man. Iron Man felt amazing, especially after the Hulk was, okay. Iron Man felt like this is cool, and Tony's awesome. And I still feel I've kind of felt that way when we reviewed it for the book again as well. Whereas it's like, this movie is pretty good. Like I'm a little shocked how good I still think Iron Man is at the start of this whole MCU thing. It was a great way to kind of get it going.
Yeah, we had we did an episode on the first Iron Man. I think about like maybe 2 years ago or a year ago now. And when we had done that, and when we had gone back and rewatched it, I was like, even after Endgame and everything, like this movie still holds up really well. It's still really solid.
Yeah. Like I wouldn't have been surprised if it sucked, honestly. But I was like, this is good. I enjoy watching this movie again. And watching it more closely because we're writing it for the book. So it's like, I'm really paying attention. I was pretty excited about how good.
Well, I think something also that first Iron Man movie did that I don't think any other, at least not live action superhero movie, had ever really done. I mean, I think you probably have to go back to, Superman the movie in 1978 to find a superhero movie where the main character actually likes being a superhero.
Oh yeah.
Where it's not a terrible burden that you have
exactly
to carry,
yeah
right?
It's like he's like I'm Iron Man, this is actually pretty cool.
That does, and that is part of the appeal of the comic books, right? Is like, as a kid growing up, it's definitely like, oh, I want to go on adventures. Actually, thinking about being like an older comic book fan, one of the weirdest experiences with the MCU is growing up in the 80s and 90s. Like X-Men was everything, right? X-Men was everywhere, and to see the Avengers sort of eclipse them over the last like 20 years has been one of the weirdest experiences for me, because I remember, the 70s Roger Stern era was really good. Some of the 80s Avengers comics are really, really good. But I don't, the 90s Avengers comics were rough. There were some rough, rough eras then. And I could never imagine that they would ever overtake X-Men, and to just see them everywhere is kind of an amazing thing.
Well, I mean, it got so bad that they had to hire Rob Liefeld to try and revitalize it.
Oh yeah.
We don't talk about that. We don't talk about Harrison Ford.
It's crazy too, because I feel like this MCU version of the Avengers is actually a pretty good fit with the Avengers in the comic, and it feels like in the continuity. Because frankly, if you had asked me however many years ago what the Avengers movie would be that'd be successful, I thought it'd be kind of like the Bendis years, because Bendis was like of Avengers was when that kind of the Avengers actually sold well. We got Wolverine, we got Spider-Man, we've got everybody, the Hulk's here, everybody you like is thrown on the team. And we've got sort of the, to me, slow pacing of Bendis stuff, which I don't know if it worked in a movie, but I just assumed that was the Avengers that was popular, that actually sort of hit that, oh, this is popular. And I thought that would be what the movies would be, but they're not really that.
Yeah, I thought they would have gone with the Ultimates that Mark Miller was doing at the time.
I thought it very Ultimates focus.
But I think that was what originally was the plan, because Zach Penn had originally wrote the screenplay for Avengers, but then when Joss Whedon came on, he had kind of rewritten everything. And I think, we could say, Whedon is, he's a monster, obviously, but he also knew what he was doing with this, because he was, and I think him being a fan of the old school comics, I think he really brought in a lot of those sensibilities. And I was frankly kind of surprised when, I saw the first Avengers movie. I'm like, oh, wow, this is actually a lot like those 70s and 80s issues.
Yeah, the banter for sure. And then they did it was an interesting tightrope, because they do basically the ultimate storyline with the Chitauri and all of that, but with more of that 70s 80s feel. So it's not like full on Millar, like Captain America doesn't say that the doesn't stand for France, right? God. That never happened. So but it's kind of cool. It's like they really thread the needle to make something modern out of that old original group of Avengers, and it actually really works.
It's interesting too, because you do have like Hawkeye and Black Widow working for S.H.I.E.L.D. and all this is very much an Ultimates concept, but we don't have sort of the extreme Mark Millar way of doing it with some diminishing returns. I never got that much into the Ultimates, so I wouldn't have preferred that. Although again, I would have thought that could have been what the successful Avengers were at the movie. In theory, that's what the Ultimate Universe was supposed to do, right? Get rid of this continuity and do modern, in many cases, edgy versions of the heroes that we could sell to Hollywood. So it's interesting how much that didn't become what this MCU is.
And I think also kind of what you guys were talking about, and I think this kind of like sums it up, is I think the MCU has done a really good job of distilling like the purest versions of these characters, and like kind of like taking all these different interpretations of them over the decades, and just kind of like finding that perfect essence, as opposed to say like, you look at all the different Batman films, each director, it's like their version of Batman. It's not like we haven't, outside of the animated series, we haven't seen like a pure distillation of that character, I don't think. And same thing with Spider-Man. You have these, each director's kind of putting their own stamp on it, or with the X-Men as well. But the MCU, they really kind of found those big perfect essences of those characters and really kind of distilled it pretty perfectly into something that's, a little bit modern, a little bit different, but it feels right.
Yeah, for sure. So actually your comment there, Perry, is a good transition to Iron Man 3, which I think actually is very much a Shane Black movie first, and like a Marvel movie like second, right?
So we're talking about Iron Man 3 today, and so when it comes to the MCU, basically I love all of it. I mean, I even love the Dark World. And when I go back and I marathon these movies, Iron Man 3 is the one I leave out of my rewatch because that is the one that that is the only one that I think I can actually say I dislike. There are ones that all of the others I like on some level, and a big part of it was the Mandarin stuff for me when I saw it in the theater, because I felt like if this had been Batman or the X-Men, like you would never do to the Joker, or you would never do in an X-Men movie to Magneto what Shane Black does to the Mandarin. You'd never completely tear apart that idea of the arch rival so much. My view has softened now because now Marvel has done some backpedaling, and we had the All Hail the King one shot, and then we got, and I remember back in the day arguing with people. I'm like, you can do a good version of the Mandarin if you get someone like Tony Leung to play him. And then sure enough, in Shang-Chi, we get Tony Leung playing the real Mandarin, and it's perfect. So I'm a little bit, so I've softened on it since then, because I think that it's hard. I don't think you get to Shang-Chi and Tony Leung's Mandarin unless you have this movie first. So that aspect of it I've softened on, but I still do have some other issues with this movie. Although I do remember at the time, so summer 2013, there were 3 big comic book movies that were coming out. It was Iron Man 3, it was Man of Steel, and it was the Wolverine. And I remember thinking going into that summer, I'm like, man, Iron Man 3 is going to be the best movie of the year. I'm going to love it so much. Man of Steel, it'll probably be okay. And the Wolverine, my hopes aren't really that high for it. And it turned out to be almost a complete inverse of that after I saw those 3 movies.
So that's really interesting. So, I'll be honest, I'm biased. I'm in the bag for Shane Black movies, like all the Christmas stuff, the banter with the kids. So I'm a big fan of Last Boy Scout, all of like the Lethal Weapon movies. So Shane Black, like I even like parts of the bad Predator movie that he made. I think it's okay. But I really enjoyed this movie. The beginning of it, I think Gordon and I were talking about this but in preparation for today's episode. And the beginning of the movie is really, like, I think a little wacky. It stops and starts at all these weird points. And the storyline, I think, has a hard time kind of like coming to fruition. And it's interesting that I think a lot of fans really hated the Mandarin thing that Shane Black did.
Mm-hmm.
But I think at the time, I remember thinking to myself, like, before they cast Ben Kingsley as Mandarin, I really didn't know how you could get away from a yellow face, like a yellow terror version of that character. And I appreciated that they are really, they were trying to do something a little bit different with the character to kind of like, make him still like sort of a terrorist, but also there's a lot of commentary in this movie about, and for us from a leadership perspective, like the perception of what this terrorist leader should look like, that he's made up and that he's, puffed up for corporate profits. So it's a really interesting movie from that perspective.
I wonder a little bit on, so I think the movie plays interestingly over time. With the rewatch here, I think it's kind of an interesting situation because I think Cy is very much on team Iron Man 3 is a good movie.
Mm-hmm.
And Perry, obviously you're not on team this is a good movie. Watching it again, and I'd watch it for the book as well, I'm a little bit more towards the middle. Mm-hmm. That I think it's okay and I see some of the value. One thing I do wonder with the movie and the Mandarin is, do you think there'll be more Iron Man movies after this one? And so if you think there's going to be more Iron Man movies, I think burning Mandarin is a bad idea. Mm-hmm. But if this is the last Iron Man movie, which I kind of feel like that was the idea, it's crazy how early the Iron Man movies are done, right? Yeah. They get done so early, it's barely past Avengers. This almost blows up this whole MCU thing as into the stratosphere.
Because it was a weird time because
done.
Yeah, it was a weird time because this was the last movie in Downey's original contract, and you had that aspect of it. Plus, this was also right smack dab in the middle of when the Disney buyout of Marvel was happening. So you also had, this is really this is like the last movie that Paramount was involved in. And so in a lot of ways, it's weird because I think it's considered the start of phase 2, but at the same time, it's also like this ending of it's more like an epilogue to phase one than anything else, I
Yeah.
think.
So I feel like too, there's a weird part where, yeah, this feels like this could be the end of Iron Man, but it isn't that at all, because he stayed around and they kept making movies. So kind of the message of the movie to some degree is he doesn't need the armor. And we talk about this in the chapter. He doesn't need the armor. He needs to trust others and let them in. But then, as he says at the end of the film, like, I'm Iron Man, I don't need to be the suit. I'm just Iron Man as a person, even if I don't have the suit on.
Right.
I think from an arc perspective, I think that's reasonable for him. It just plays so weird now because he's going to put the suit back on.
Yeah,
right?
there's
Iron
a
Man in the same way.
rewatching that. Sorry, go ahead.
And it's just strange because to me, his arc, and Perry, if you looked at the chapters some, to me, his arc of the rest of the movies is like he wants to be the hero. He's not the behind the scenes financer. He's not the guy playing it safe. He needs to be the hero doing that. And so he might be Iron Man inside, but he also needs the iron suit outside to still save the day. So to some degree, we've kind of invalidated the ending of that film. He is Iron Man on the inside, and I think he grew some from the film, and he doesn't need to depend on the suit, but he still needs it. So I don't know. It's a weird mess of, as he's so many more movies and so many bigger stakes, that he didn't end there, which it kind of set up for him to do that.
Yeah, it does. It's so weird rewatching it the other night and just seeing how, we get to that the clean slate protocol, and he blows up all the suits, and in my mind I'm just thinking of, like, as soon as he drives off to this, wherever he's moving to, he's just going to build a new suit.
Yeah,
well, I think that's actually. Yeah. So I actually think it's super interesting, because the story of the movie is that the suit is a crutch, right? Like, he went into the wormhole, and I think in the chapter, Gordon, we do talk about this, right? That he's got this PTSD, and it's very much entwined with the suit, right? He keeps building new suits because he thinks he can prepare for every situation, every scenario, and he has to kind of, like, at least metaphorically, give up the suit so that he can just live his life. And that's one of the things I really like about the movie, is that it does have this, like, complete arc within itself, where at the very end, sure, he's going to wear the suit again at some point if he comes back. But at least for the purposes of his PTSD, he's kind of gone through that, and he's kind of come to terms with that experience. I also absolutely love the ending to the movie. I think it's one of the better action sequences in the MCU. The idea that you've got all of these suits, and every suit that, like, when you were a kid and you thought about Iron Man, that's what you thought of. You're like, oh, I'm going to pull out this Hulkbuster armor. I'm going to wear the underwater armor. I'm going to do this armor. And that was so much fun to kind of watch and see, and especially taking on all the extremist guys. That was super cool. So I think that's where I'm also a sucker for action. So if a movie has some good action sequences, I'll forgive a lot. And I think, one of the complaints about the MCU is that the third act, they always seem like big CGI fests. But this one really brought the theme of the movie, the theme of the character together in a very nice way. So I was like, oh, this seems cool to me. Even though, like, I knew, everybody knows, like, oh, sure, he's gonna hang up the suit. Sure, sure, Tony, you're not coming back.
One of the things I thought about this movie, and Sai, you had mentioned, being a big Shane Black guy. Like, I love Shane Black. Don't get me wrong. Can't agree with you on Predator. I couldn't really find anything redeeming in that. That's another story. But like Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, brilliant movie, and I love his style. And I think one of the issues I had with this movie, beyond all the Mandarin stuff, is it's a little bit too Shane Black, right? It kind of feels like Shane Black just wanted to be able to parody himself on Marvel's dime, and I think that his sensibilities, his vision, it kind of overpowers the character a bit, and I think that's one of the big issues.
Where the balance is too, right?
Yeah.
So yeah. I feel like with Eternals, it didn't feel specific enough to the director, but also didn't have like, it's a Marvel movie, you can tell, but it doesn't do it that well. And the Shane Black maybe is a little bit too much on the end of this is a fun Shane Black film. You know, I think there's a tonal question between this Iron movie and the previous ones and where we're going, where to some degree it's like the guy from Kiss Kiss Bang Bang happens to have the Iron Man suit and he looks the same. I'm not against that because I like that, but it is there. I would agree with you. There's some question of, is this too much? Is it not enough of the house style?
Yeah, I think of all the directors who have done MCU movies, I think James Gunn is the one who would manage to completely blend those two ideas of, you know, this is my own personal style, but I'm also matching it with the MCU style.
Yeah, I think the first hour of Guardians of the Galaxy is the best, most enjoyable overall MCU experience. It's just, it moves so quick too, because a lot of these movies don't, you know, they're like 2.5 hours long and there's setup. Like we've got them, we've got the orb, we got that fight at the beginning, we've got everybody fighting, we go to jail, we're doing a jailbreak. That stuff happens so quick in Guardians that you're just like, I don't know how the other movies could have done this more well. The pacing is just great in that first hour of Guardians, and Gunn really takes it really well.
And the pacing in Iron Man 3, the first hour is not great. It's like starting, stopping, Happy gets hurt, you know, I'm going on this mystery. Hey, there's a kid. Like there's all these like weird things that are just kind of like clashing into each other. And it isn't until you get in well into the second hour that things really gel. The mystery starts to formulate. You start to really get, you know, some cool, you know, some more fun action, and also some interesting introspection from Tony, right?
I think for me, actually, that up until the attack on his mansion, like that first act of the, I actually love that part. I thought that was, I mean, you make some good points about the pacing, and those are definitely valid. But I think what intrigued me so much was just like the buildup, and just like, oh man, he's, you know, Tony's got all these issues, and we've got like the worst villain he's ever faced, and he's got no backup, and it's just like this slow buildup of tension, and then it really loses me when he teams up with, you know, 80s stereotypical teen sidekick.
Yeah, reject from Stranger Things.
Yeah. Like right down to the name, Harley Keener, which is like the most 80s, 90s kid sidekick name ever.
Yeah, it literally just walked off the set of Last Boy Scout to join this movie, right? Like, yeah, and it's totally like, and I think that's like a jarring, especially they're in Tennessee. They're on this like, it's almost like a video game where you go on like this side quest, right?
Yeah.
Like there's the big Mandarin problem that you've got to deal with, but before you can do that, you have to like figure out what's going on with this kid and figure out what's happening. But I think that's important for at least to kind of get some of that stuff about the PTSD and some of the stress that he's dealing with to, you know, sort of face that outside of the suit. And I think it's tough for, in comparison to the other Iron Man movies, but I think move a little bit quicker in that middle part. It does sag a little bit, so it makes it a little weird.
Yeah, from a plotting perspective, like I think the kid is there important to be like Tony interacting with not his own employees in a different environment. But like he goes to Tennessee to like see some burns on a wall, and then somebody hands him a folder of information out of if I remember correctly, it's just like the lady was bringing it in for somebody else, and Tony just happens to show up and be like, hey, give me that folder. And then I guess it was the extremist people that wanted the folder. And then, you know, they burned down various places in town, and he's like, I got the folder, which I didn't know I need. I'm leaving. Is interesting. So to me, the kid part, other than being precocious, makes sense for his arc. But the whole being there really does, as Sai says, feels like a weird side quest. Because like, why do I need the folder? Like, does Tony use that for anything really? Like, I don't feel like that was the case based on when I was watching.
Yeah, it feels like that was when it felt the most Shane Blackiest to me. It was when it was that stuff. That was when he's just, you know, I think if ever you had a doubt that Shane Black was just kind of doing a self-parody here, I think that moment when he meets the kid, I think that kind of like dispels any any doubt we have about that at that point. And that's like, even now the Mandarin stuff, like I said, I've softened on it because of what we had afterwards, so I can deal with it. But that stuff aside, like it is still like the very Shane Black of it that kind of takes me out of the movie a lot when I'm rewatching it. And but I think there's also some really good stuff in there, and I think like the whole idea of Tony being separated from his tech and having to kind of do all this stuff on its own. I think this movie does do a good job with that aspect of it, and showing like how he has to, basically MacGyver his way into these situations. And I really like that aspect of it, especially when you contrast it with the end scene where Rhodey's like is the one who's taking charge before the armor run shows up, and Tony is completely out of his element. He has no idea what he's doing. I thought that was a really good way of showing just like these two, how he's very specialized in this one area, but just because he's a brilliant engineer doesn't mean he knows how to be an action hero.
Yeah, that's true. I think that's a really interesting contrast. I noticed you said something really interesting that I wanted to come back to, which was, do you really think the Mandarin is like the #1 Iron Man villain? Because I always thought it was Justin Hammer, going back to like Armor Wars and stuff like that. And so a lot of people told me later on when they were talking about Iron Man 3 that they love the Mandarin and they think he's like the big villain for him. And I've never really felt that way about the Mandarin character. I don't even think there's a particularly great comic book story. And it's interesting because this movie takes like what comic book story I actually really like, which is Extremis, and then grafts that onto the Mandarin storyline as well. So I think that's kind of cool, and then brings in AIM with Aldrich Killian.
Have you ever read Haunted? It came out in like the post Civil War era. That was a Mandarin story. That was a really good one. And I think I had argued back at the time when this came out that if you want to do a good Mandarin story that completely divorces him from the Yellow Peril stereotypes, Haunted does a really good job of doing that, because in fact, he's not even wearing the rings anymore. Now he's had them grafted onto his spine. So like the powers are all kind of like inborn. And I think there's because the Mandarin's rings originally in the comics, for anyone who doesn't know, is they're alien technology. And I think there's a very easy way to kind of fit that into what Tony's going through, because he's just had this alien encounter and he has all this PTSD. He's having trouble dealing with it. And especially and I think there was kind of a missed opportunity there, because we had all this stuff dealing with the Chitauri tech that was left over. And I think there was a real kind of opportunity to kind of introduce the Mandarin that way, and that he's someone who, whereas Tony is completely terrified of this tech and this alien stuff, the Mandarin is someone who is able to adopt it and integrate it into himself so much. I think you could have done a very good contrast between them if you had gone with that take. Now you do pose an interesting question, going back to what you said about is it Justin Hammer or is it the Mandarin? It's a good question, and I think it depends on where the conflict lies. Because if you're thinking about it in terms of ideology, I think you make a stronger case for the Mandarin, because especially if you're looking at it in the Cold War context, because you had Tony Stark, the symbol of capitalism, whereas in the Mandarin you have the symbol of feudalism. So you have these, this real generational struggle there. Whereas with Justin Hammer, he's just like the evil Tony Stark, basically. So it kind of depends on how you want to define that relationship about the arch nemesis. And I think it's kind of like asking who's Spider-Man's greatest villain. Is it the Green Goblin or is it Dr. Octopus, right? And it depends on how you want to define that relationship.
I do think, for me at least, for Tony Stark, his greatest villain is always himself.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I think that you
it's
definitely
alcoholism,
make that
things like Civil War, it's going too far.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that's sort of Tony not in control, getting out of control, and I think a lot of the movie is like Pepper being like, hey, interact with the world, and he's like, I'm building a robot and cracking jokes to myself in the basement, right? Mm-hmm. And so to me, Tony is somebody who often is working off of others versus somebody that needs that villain to work off of. Tony is, at times a mess, and it's getting himself together and doing what he needs to do to get him to be successful. And also, I think it's a question of where he is it as an individual or on a team. Tony Stark on a team to me is very different in what his role feels, where on his own, his personal demons can do more stuff while you don't have that working as well while the Avengers are fighting, Fin Fan Foom or something. He needs to do stuff and be smart. Well, on his own, he can be like, I've lost grip on reality and I'm drinking a little too much. And then the villain doesn't matter as much. Somebody else who's a technocrat, some use of his stuff being used by evil people, to me, is a good enough Tony Stark arc on his own.
I think it might come down to, Justin Hammer is the best Tony Stark villain. The Mandarin is the best Iron Man villain, I think, especially if you look at it in like the more classic depictions of the Mandarin, where he's much more anti-technology. Then I think you have that a much stronger contrast between the two then. But yeah, it's a good question. I think Gordon makes a really good point that it ultimately is both of these aspects. They're dark reflections of these different aspects of Tony Stark's worst attributes. And, it's Justin Hammer. It's basically, if Tony Stark had no moral compass whatsoever. And, the Mandarin is if Tony Stark had just, completely, allowed him, had just, completely gone mad with the power he has, the wealth, the technology, all that. So I think that you can, but I think it definitely comes down to, it's basically, you're right. Tony Stark himself is his own worst enemy. And I think that's probably why, the most famous Iron Man story in the comic books isn't, Armor Wars or Hand of the Mandarin or whatever, but the most famous story arc is Demon in a Bottle.
Yeah.
Well, and Armor Wars is about my armor. I made this. I caused.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Right. And so I think there is definitely, and Tony himself is self-centered. So his his villain would be himself. The best villain out there, that's me, Tony Stark. It makes sense to me.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because we do have a technocrat villain in Iron Man 3. We have Aldrich Killian, right? He's there as like this evil version of Tony Stark. He even wants the same girl, he has like this whole setup that's almost like a shadow organization. And it's interesting because like he, unlike Tony, he doesn't build a superhero, he builds his own super villain to be like the engine for the story. And so he takes on like the fears of terrorism to build the ultimate terror leader to attack and strike fear into the hearts of the West for all intents and purposes.
So that's a good transition. What did you guys think overall of Killian as the villain here as a character?
I'll go first. Guy Pearce is a great actor. But getting Guy Pearce in that role, I think, makes it better than probably it's written.
Yeah.
This is definitely something of a movie where we're looking at Tony Stark's past misdeeds have caused bad things to happen. But it is sort of a weird. I think if you actually watch the movie, it's hard to be like, well, he was a jerk to Killian once, and Killian became a terrible person because of it. Like, I think the movie kind of wants you to think that, but it's a very long. Like, Tony was mean to him once, and he's like, well, I guess I'm going to create a terrorist out of this. It's sort of a weird, to me, it doesn't quite follow. I think Guy does it okay, but there even is the Gwyneth Paltrow, the Pepper Potts part, where I don't know why he is so like, oh, Pepper Potts, she's the best. We don't see a very clear reason for it. It's just like Tony was a jerk, and so therefore we're on the opposite sides. And so I feel like Guy Pearce with more material could have been better in the role. And I think Killian could have been better, and the Extremis is like this interesting, instead of the armor, you're kind of pumping yourselves up with this power. It's an interesting contrast. but I don't know whether I really buy the arc there. Like, we're supposed to blame Tony, but I don't really blame him. If everyone he was a jerk to earlier became a supervillain, there would be no one but supervillains, I assume, in the MCU.
Well, plus too, I mean, like, are you supposed to entertain everybody who comes up to you with the business card when you're the head of a company? I mean, there's an aspect. I mean, I know it's supposed to portray as like, well, come on, Tony, you could have been nicer to, and yeah, maybe, but also, I kind of get where Tony's coming from too, because no matter what field you're in, and I've seen this being a writer sometimes, like, people come up to you and they're saying like, oh, could you do this, could you do that, and at some point you're just like, no, I got my own stuff that I got to worry about.
Well, it's interesting because there is another character that is inspired by Tony, right? There's the random camera guy in the van that he needs help from, who like models his whole look after Tony, tries to really
Hispanic Scott Baio.
Yeah, Hispanic Scott Baio, that's right. And my favorite Kiss Kiss Bang Bang reference, right? Like, and so they're trying to draw this connection. But I also think it's the fact that, like, from when you're a scientist, you want to have, if you meet another scientist, you're supposed to have like some sort of mutual respect. And I think we're supposed to read that as Tony could have just blown him off, but he plays this prank on him that actually inadvertently inspires all of this other stuff. And that's a theme that continues from Iron Man 2, where we saw Justin Hammer kind of like doing everything he could to be as much like Tony as possible. Like, the suit, the style, everything's like Tony. And it's really interesting to see Aldrich Killian in the sense that I think Guy Pearce brings a lot of shading to that character. And it's also interesting to see that he's trying to like deal with a real life disability that he's got, and he's kind of like trying to improve himself physically, whereas somebody like Tony, he's really using that, whatever technology he's building, he's trying to protect himself from the outside world. He's building this shell. Now, I don't think the movie communicates all that stuff very well, having watched it now like 3 or 4 times. Maybe I'm picking up on something, but I do think that that's what they're trying to go for. And I think he does a good job. In the film, Guy Pearce, I think, does a good job as that villain, but I don't think he can keep up with Ben Kingsley's ridiculous Trevor Slattery performance, which I think kind of that twist, even on the rewatch, made me laugh really, really hard. And I really feel like that once that reveal happens, the rest of it is just sort of like barreling towards action scene to action scene to action scene. We're just trying to finish the movie as quickly as possible.
To me, the Mandarin reveal feels better now because we've gotten a very good Mandarin, and I kind of understand Travis now. I know at the time I was kind of like, what is this? It just felt really weird at the time. I don't think, like Perry, I think you had much more of a negative reaction, but for me at the time I was like, what's going on? Like, it felt kind of strange, and this weird Ben Kingsley type role. Like, I like when I heard that character was coming, when the character came back, and I hadn't seen the short that he was in, so I had like no context when in Shang-Chi, and I was just like, this dude, they brought back him, and I was like, oh, he's fun. I like him. I never thought of him as somebody that was interesting or appealing, but Ben Kingsley does a great job. It's just in the context of where the movie was, it made no sense to me at the time. It just seemed like the reveal I wasn't against as much as like, what, this is so strange, just processing it to some degree.
I'm going to come back to the Ben Kingsley because I do want to talk about him. But taking it back to Killian is Gordon. I think you pretty much nailed it when you said that Pierce plays this role a lot better than it's written. And I think part of the problem is that Killian was not originally supposed to be the villain. Maya Hansen was originally supposed to be the villain, but then, this was before Feige had basically taken full control of the MCU, and Ike Perlmutter, who was still calling the shots at Marvel, who's also a notorious misogynist, he's basically like, we can't have a female villain because kids won't buy an action figure of a female villain. And so they had changed the script basically because of that. And Rebecca Hall even talked about this in interviews, how when she was cast, she was supposed to be the villain, but then it ended up getting changed to Killian. And
I had no idea.
Oh yeah,
I read
and
that.
and I think that works. It works so much better if it's Maya Hansen, because Killian, it kind of feels like, we're dealing with another version of Justin Hammer, but it's not Justin Hammer. And whereas if it was Maya Hansen, then it would have been this other aspect of Tony Stark's reckless behavior coming back and haunting him, right? The whole womanizing type of stuff. And that would also have played interesting with the fact that, he's now in this relationship with Pepper, which is only recently started in the aftermath of at the end of Iron Man 2.
Well, and he makes a joke when he sees her again of like, I can't remember everybody I've slept with, basically.
Right. Yeah.
So in terms of invalidating her as a person in a joke.
Yeah.
That would to me, that would have been a lot stronger on it of what the case is. And yeah, I think that being developed more, and to me, Killian being developed more. I like Sai's idea of sort of this, I fixed my disability, but it made me kind of a jerk.
Mhm.
And I'm more all into it because of it. Would have been a good angle for Killian in that setup. I think Maya's angle, I'd be curious what she was doing as the villain on her own. Is her motivation just being like, Tony was kind of a jerk to me back in the day? I'd be curious what you'd put as the other element of what's going on there.
I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that, but that's just one aspect that came to me off the top of my head. Although I think, Sai, when you were talking and you mentioned Justin Hammer, that really kind of made something click to me. And I think this role would have worked so much better if you brought back Justin Hammer and you had him taking on that role. I think because there's such a stronger connection with that. And it's, because literally as Tony Stark is falling apart, you have Justin Hammer coming in and building himself up. I think that would have had another good, interesting contrast between the two.
For sure. And you already established that he's like a wannabe Tony, right. Which, it's been a whole movie about that. So you could have just slid him into the place of Killian, and that would have been a really interesting situation. I'm genuinely surprised that they never brought Sam Rockwell back as a villain, even a side villain in one of the Avengers movies, because he was really good in Iron Man 2.
He did appear at the end of the one shot, All Hail the King, in prison.
Oh yeah. That's right.
But yeah, I've been wanting to, because I know some people had issues with his performance in Iron Man 2. I loved Sam Rockwell in Iron Man 2. I thought he was like one of the best parts of that movie. And I thought, they're doing an Armor Wars series on Disney Plus starring Don Cheadle. So I'm hoping they bring back Sam Rockwell for that, because I think that is like the perfect opportunity. And if you don't get him back in that, I don't think you get him back ever, basically. But and I did want to talk about Ben Kingsley, and I think the reveal, it completely took me out of the movie when I was sitting there in the theater. And that scene when Rhodey's like, he's like kind of dumbfounded, and he's like, what are you? And then Tony's like, are you serious? And Tony's like, yeah, it's embarrassing. I felt they were speaking for what I was feeling in that moment. But that aside, I think Kingsley he does a brilliant job in this. And I think he, so seamlessly transitions between those two aspects, the Mandarin persona and Trevor Slattery. And you'd be forgiven for thinking it was two different actors, because, he's, and that's kind of also why I was kind of disappointed in the reveal, is because not only from being the perspective of an Iron Man fan, but also the perspective of Ben Kingsley is just so damn chilling in that beginning of the movie.
Yeah, I think he's really good. The accents that he's able to pull off, the weird speeches that he gives, I think are really, really terrific. And I think that's what makes the reveal so jarring for a lot of people, because you really, especially in the promotional material leading up to Iron Man 3, he was a big part of that. You were like, whoa, this is legit Mandarin happening with, Ben Kingsley. What can we expect? And I remember looking at some of the promo materials and going like, how far are we going to go into the war on terror in this movie? And I was a little nervous about what they were going to end up showing in terms of that part of the film. And so maybe that's why I took the kind of turn a little bit better than a lot of other people that were at the theater with me that night.
Gordon, how about you? What did you think about Ben Kingsley's performance?
I think his performance is really good. I do think a lot of the early part, he does seem very menacing and it's interesting, but it makes so much sense as him being an actor.
Mhm.
So like him talking about fortune cookies and all this in sort of this very dramatic way. Like I think it sucks you in early, but then when you're like, oh, that dude's an actor who's, he's just good at emoting, you're like, oh, that makes sense.
Mhm.
So I think it pulls together well in that regard. I think the movie and its discussion of terrorism and all of that, it could be more integrated if it's important. You've kind of got the Mandarin doing stuff in the opening, and he's out there and he's the threat and he blows up Tony's house. But like what this terrorism means or how it connects, you don't really get. It makes sense with it being sort of just a feign versus a real thing, but it does kind of hurt what is the message of this. I think the concept of, oh, this is where we build up these boogeymen of various sorts, and that's bad because it justifies bad behavior or violation of rights or killing people. But it's not central enough to the plot to really be unpacked in a meaningful way to my mind. I'm glad it wasn't, to some degree, as size, I can completely understand size perspective, that it could be done very poorly of blaming people and being really about and othering, and instead it goes in a different direction where it doesn't do that, because that is something with some of those original Mandarin stories. They're very in retrospect very racist.
Oh,
and
yeah,
very,
yeah.
the Mandarin is this sort of idea. There's a bunch of early Avenger issues with communists where it's like the communists only do evil things and they're secretly evil robots, and there's a lot of weird stuff where just like, this feels really racist and also just strange. Like it just doesn't even make sense.
The first issue of Fantastic Four, when Sue's whole rationale is like, we have to get to space because we have to beat the commies to space.
yeah
Yeah, there's a lot of that going on. And I think you guys both touched on something. I think that's kind of one of the issues I still have with this movie is it's got so many ideas I like, but they don't quite seem to connect. And I think like the whole idea of, creating your own terrorist threat. I mean, it's such a smart commentary on the history of U.S. foreign policy and the military industrial complex. And there's so much to unpack there. And I think it gets kind of lost in the whole idea that, this is basically about a guy who got snubbed by some other guy at a party.
Yeah.
Listen, I was hurt at a party once, and I was Joker pilled, and I caused a lot of problems. So I can relate very clearly to this. But it is interesting that it seems to boil down to that. And I wonder if, now that I know that Ike Perlmutter just like decided to throw in another villain, there's always that rule that when you have two villains in a movie, it can make things a little harder. Now that we've got three, maybe that threw things off a little bit in terms of like getting things to work and kind of function the way that Shane Black had originally conceived of the movie.
Yeah,
I think this is kind of a personal story too, because it's sort of this story of Tony getting over his addiction to the armor. I would argue the movie makes it sound like he's going to stop being Iron Man, and that's not what happens. As we know, he's back. But it's sort of a personal story with a thrown-on political element that doesn't get well developed. I think there's that question with War Machine across movies as well, of being actually part of the military. What's the role of sort of superheroes that really work for the government, work for the military? Some comics have gotten at that better or worse, but there's always that question of what does that mean? Because I always feel like if you had superheroes in real life, they'd either be really corporate like Ecstatics or some of these other, or they'd all be just government propaganda pieces, or they'd be trying to rule us like the Authority or other groups or various dystopian like Kingdom Come and these types of areas where the superheroes take over, the power take over, or we see that with mutants and X-Men as well in those dystopias.
Yeah, I think that's it's so weird because that personal element of Tony's story, it does really connect to that, that theme of like, the military industrial complex and creating your own enemies. And I think that the movie, I think the movie's trying to do too much with all these different themes. And I think that's kind of the curse of this being the third and what everyone at the time thought was more than likely going to be the final movie, that it's kind of like, okay, well, we got to deal with what happened to him in Avengers, but we also have the relationship with Pepper. We got to give Rhodey something to do because he just became War Machine in the last movie. And oh yeah, we forgot to use his biggest supervillain, so we have to throw him in some way too. And I think it's trying to mix all those different elements together, and I think that's, and then also you have, like we said, Ike Perlmutter coming in and saying like, no, we got to do this, we got to do this, we got to do this, and it all just kind of mixes everything together, and you don't get a real coherent, I guess in that respect. I mean, it's kind of amazing that the movie is as good as it is.
Yeah, I wonder too, if you spread out the Man movies, what that effect would be.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at them, they're made so quickly, especially compared to the overall line. Is you've got Iron Man 1 and then Iron Man 2, and that's like the next step, in the MCU, and Iron Man 3 starts phase 2, and then it's done. I feel like there almost wasn't enough time to figure out what arc should Tony have in these individual films, because I do think there's a decent amount of these characters get sucked into the overall arc and they don't get their same amount. So even like, Captain America Civil War, that's really an Avengers movie with a Captain America focus. We kind of lose a lot of that suddenly these characters, single movies, become really stealth Avenger movies or stealth most Captain America and the Avenger movies type thing, which I think is an interesting question. Iron Man kind of gets to do his whole arc without bringing in anyone other than his own people, but it does, I think, does a little bit of disservice to giving time for it to breathe and figuring out who is Tony and where how does he fit in with his stuff as it goes. A later one, once we've got all these superheroes, would be interesting to see how Tony interacts with the world when he's not in the middle of this huge Avenger mission or whatever.
Yeah, I thought we got some little teases of that. Unfortunately, not enough for my taste, but we got a little bit of that in Civil War. We got a little bit of that in Homecoming. It would have been nice to see more of that and where that would have gone.
Well, it's interesting. I think Iron Man actually, Tony Stark repeats some of these stories, right? Like if you think about, Endgame, he's got to make the ultimate sacrifice. Well, he already did that in Avengers 1. He was willing to go into the in Civil War, he's trying to protect the planet. He wants to build the perfect, way to protect everybody. But he kind of already did that in Iron Man 3, right? He kind of,
and also in Age of Ultron as well.
That's right. So I feel like maybe the MCU arc is sort of like repeating a little bit because they want Robert Downey Jr. to maybe play some of the same notes throughout the movies, whereas I think Captain America and some of the other characters get to grow a little bit more, maybe movie for movie.
I think that's a good point too. And I was thinking about, and I think that's another reason why I kind of leave this out of rewatches, because I think a lot of the stuff that this movie does for Tony, other movies do, and they do it a little bit better. I think like the whole idea of like the PTSD and all that, I think that's covered a lot better in Age of Ultron and Infinity War. I think the whole the idea of like the relying on the armor as a crutch and relying too much on the superhero aspect, I think he kind of learns that lesson in other movies as well through like his experiences in Civil War and Endgame and all that kind of stuff. And I think so it does kind of feel like this movie doesn't really offer anything different in those aspects of it.
I feel like you could make some argument of his own personal arc and then his arc of working with others. So something like Civil War, we've got sort of this conflict of who should rule the Avengers. Should it be like the UN or should it be the team? And to some degree, even if Tony's in a better place of himself, he doesn't really know how to compromise on this or work with people to save the Avengers versus the whole thing kind of blowing up. And we've got a chapter in the book about conflict. And it's really interesting to look at that fight between Cap and Iron Man, where Iron Man's like, we should just abdicate our responsibility and let, the government take care of this. and Cap is like, we shouldn't let the government have any say in what we do. We should make the call, which is interesting when you think about Cap has a whole movie of big conspiracy taking, Shield is a big conspiracy to say, let's give over to some faceless bureaucrats. I can completely understand that's not something that he would want from a practical perspective or from his own perspective on it. But there's so much room for compromise, to my mind, where you could have come up with something where the UN safeguards in some way. The comics have Guy Ritchie and other people, be involved in the team from the government. But instead, it's either do Tony's or do Caps. No one tries to come up with some compromise that would work. And it leads to all the problems.
You mentioned Gyrick in there, and I think, just a little side note. I thought basically in Civil War, Martin Freeman was essentially Peter Gyrick in that movie.
Yeah,
he had like the exact same personality, the exact same characteristics. I don't know why they didn't just go with making him Henry Peter Gyrick, because it fits him so much better than Everett Ross. I thought, because he's like completely different from Everett Ross in the. That's another story.
Oh yeah, I'd agree with that.
You gotta set him up for Black Panther.
Yeah.
Set him up for Black Panther. There you
go. But one of the things too, I think is interesting about Cap and Tony's story arcs in these movies is Tony goes from being kind of, rebellious and almost like anti-establishment to some extent to being very much like pro-establishment, whereas Cap is the opposite. He's very much starts off as this pro-establishment, do what you're told figure, and then he becomes, the rebel. I thought that was a really interesting contrast in their progressions over these movies.
Yeah. I feel with that the Avengers too, and this drawing of the whole country type stuff, it really needed to be played more, because I could see you being like, we caused so much death. We just have to, we are the danger. We need to let the government take over or somebody. But I don't feel in Avengers 2 well enough to feel like, oh yeah, Tony's perspective, that it makes sense that Tony in Civil War is like abdicate responsibility. I think we can talk about his arc as a character where it's not just progress for him. He goes back and forth and he's got these multiple spheres of life, but it feels kind of weird for him to abdicate, especially if you look at kind of Civil War in the comics being very different in sort of how that plays out. It feels kind of like he's passively being like, oh, the government should run stuff. They just need to tell me what to do. That doesn't really fit that well with him, to my mind, at least.
I think in the context of Age of Ultron, I think it works. It works for me because I think that one of my biggest things about Civil War in the comics is that, Tony basically becomes a straight up supervillain. Like there's
problems there.
Yeah, there's a lot of problems with that. I mean, he's very fashy in that comic. And whereas I think in this, he kind of, I think, this, and if in retrospect, if they had planned this out a little bit better, but Marvel it's not as well planned out as people think it is. Like they are kind of like, flying by the seat of their pants a little bit. And I think if they had planned it out a little bit better, you could have had something set up with, like an Armor Wars type of thing or something similar to that in Iron Man 3. And then you go on to him creating Ultron and the Avengers. And then you really have kind of a reason for it's like, oh shit, I'm going too far. I need someone to hold me back. I think there's that subtext there, but I think you make a good point. It's not quite illustrated as well as it could have been.
Well, I think it's
I understand. That's the thing. Yeah.
Like
it seems like he could have, it just wasn't built up enough.
Right. Yeah.
Well, he's a military contractor, right? Mm-hmm. So like if you're thinking about an ultimate authority that Tony Stark would appeal to like keep things under control, but what were the superpowers before everybody had superpowers?
Right.
It was governments. So it kind of makes sense on that level, I think, that he would just be like, listen, we need some UN board or somebody, because that's what he would do. That's who he worked with as a weapons manufacturer. He'd be like, okay, I'm going to sell to the government. And I think that part of it clicked for me when I watched that transition for him in Civil War. Of course, he's going to say like, yeah, we need a government body in here because that's who he would appeal to. I think Captain America also had, it's weird, in the first Avenger, he's part of a military establishment, but it's like outside the normal reins of government. right? So Shield, or whatever the proto Shield was back in World War II, they were doing their own thing, fighting their own villain. And I feel like he carried a lot of that, and then it got worse in Civil War because he's like, no, we not Civil War, sorry, Winter Soldier. When he realizes that this has been corrupted, he's like, no, we can't have anybody controlling us now. We need to, as superhero or superpowered people, we need to be the ones in charge, because these other government agencies can be infiltrated by bad guys, and we need to kind of hold that responsibility. So I think from that level, maybe it wasn't so clearly communicated, but I think it kind of works for that. And it makes the conflict really interesting. Now rewatching Civil War, watching it like that in quick succession, I think it's easier to see a lot of those connections rather than like, oh, we waited 2 years to see this, and now it's a little bit easier to connect.
I think so Cap to me is motivated very reasonably. Cap, I'm not surprised at all. To me, Tony needs more to do that, because also this isn't like he's selling weapons to like the U.S. government, right? And he's just like, well, we'll just let the UN, the general world, I don't know, the world government will take over running the Avengers. It's very vague because it doesn't see any relationship with them. So if it was like, oh, like Rhodey's gonna run, he's gonna be our liaison to the whatever government you want to call it, I'd feel a lot more reasonable if that was the case. I just don't see him having a relationship with it. I think Sinai, we talked about before, who exactly is taking over. Is it the UN? Is it something in the UN? It was kind of vaguely defined, I feel like, a little bit.
As I recall, it was a UN panel. That's what that's what it was said in the movie, I believe.
I think that's literally the shadows at the end of Avengers. Those shadow guys, right?
Yeah. And it just feels like it's not people they know, or like if I felt Tony had a relationship with the shadow guys or something, I'd be like, yeah, of course he trusts these people, right? Whether he should or not is an open question. But I don't see why he's trusting like unknown government bureaucrat. Feels weird to me. Still,
yeah, I can see that. It does ultimately come up to, I think it comes up to shell shock from their most recent adventures, whereas for Cap, it's he had trusted Shield, and then Shield had gone bad, and he's just like, oh no, we can't leave these decisions up to, we have to make all these decisions ourselves. Whereas Tony is, he made all the decisions himself, and created a genocidal robot, and then he's like, okay, clearly I'm not the one who should be making decisions. And I think it's an overreaction, but I think I think
maybe
you make
it's
a good
the PSD and stress, where it's really like I'm abdicated, because it is a very extreme abdication of that.
One other thing I wanted to talk about, and this is really the kind of like final point I had about this movie, is I really like the elevated role that Happy got in this movie to an extent, at least in comparison to the first two movies. And I think a big part of that is because Jon Favreau's not directing this time, so he was able to just kind of like. And he had said this in interviews, he was able to just kind of like relax and just kind of like, and I really like his portrayal of Happy. And I'm really glad we got to see more of that in this movie. And of course we ended up getting it in great effect in the Spider-Man trilogy. But also I really liked how the relationship is done between Tony and Rhodey. And I think this was kind of touched on a little bit in Iron Man 2, whereas I thought Terrence Howard felt very exasperated. Terrence Howard's Rhodey felt very exasperated with Tony, and I had a hard time believing that they were really friends, because it kind of felt like it kind of felt like the military was telling him to be Tony's friend as opposed to him actually caring about Tony. Yeah. Whereas with Don Cheadle, I got more of a sense that there's a relationship between his Rhodey and Downey's Stark. And I thought they really play it up in this movie. And I love the whole lethal weapon of it when they're working together at the action scene at the end.
Yeah, that's part of what I really loved about that action scene is how they can share, the screen as almost equals. And I mean, we do talk a little bit in the book about something called leader-member exchange, where there are people that are followers, and ostensibly in this movie and in the other movies, Rhodey is always like a follower of Tony almost. And they have this good relationship where they can kind of joke around, and even when they're kind of far apart on an issue, or wearing the Iron Patriot armor, they have a strong enough relationship where they can come back together and still work together. And I really enjoy that. I also saw that with with the relationship between Tony and Pepper in the same end of this movie. I really feel like they were able to show them as like equals, and that they were able to give her a couple of good, moments, like, fight moments to kind of protect Tony, especially without the armor. But that's also part of the theme of the movie, is being able to kind of share the responsibility of this armor, not just with with Pepper, but also with Rhodey himself, and being able to say, like, yeah, when I need them, I can depend on these folks. I think that's also a big part of the story arc of the film, even though he had sort of that moment in the Avengers, since we're talking about the cyclical nature of Iron Man storylines. You would think that that would carry over, but he still, in his own personal life, also needed to be able to kind of hand things off. And you kind of see that a little bit with the Happy story, because he doesn't want Happy to pursue this, this investigation that ends up getting him hurt. But he kind of comes to terms with that and recognizes how much Happy means to him. Especially in the first movie, he doesn't seem to have that kind of relationship with Happy at all. He's kind of like an elevated bodyguard driver kind of guy. But by this third movie, he seems to have a much stronger relationship with Happy.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think it's such an important part of Iron Man 3 is those relationships, and trusting these people and their input really matters. And we mentioned that in the chapter as well. A little bit is just sort of, he needs these people, Captain America, Pepper, to kind of like call him on stuff, and he needs to be willing to listen to it, which I think is the harder part. I think he cares about these people and respects them, but he's always kind of done his own thing without listening, because it's went well for him, and he's often been the one paying. And I think in theory, Iron Man 3 with blowing the stuff up and all that is partly I need to depend on other people, not the armor and myself. And to me, that's a very interesting arc for the movie to go with. He's going to need the armor later on, but he's still Iron Man inside regardless. And he's got these people in his life. He's willing to get the heart surgery. He can trust others to do so. Now, he doesn't do that consistently. He backslides. He has some other issues. But I do think from that perspective, it's a step towards, that level of trusting others and being who he is versus Tony Stark, the man who does what he wants and doesn't need to listen to anybody, in that way.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's pretty much all I really wanted to say about Iron Man 3. Do you guys have any final thoughts you wanted to say about the movie? Let's start with Cy.
All right. If you like Shane Black and you're okay with a weird middle and maybe kind of stopping and starting in the beginning a little bit, then I think Iron Man 3 might be the Iron Man for you. It might be, other than Iron Man 1 and Iron Man 3, like Iron Man 3 is a little bit lower than Iron Man 1 for me, in terms of the movies, but I really enjoyed it. I liked watching it again. I may revisit it one more time, who knows? But I really enjoyed it, and I think it's a nice melding of a couple of different Iron Man stories. I do wish I would have liked to have seen an Iron Man, maybe an Iron Man 4, to see what else they could have done with his like solo adventures, because there are some other villains that they never really got to with Iron Man that pop up in other movies, like Ghost. I think it's a really cool villain, but they kind of used an Ant-Man and the Wasp. But still really cool movie and a lot of fun. And you know what? I didn't think that we would have this kind of discussion about Iron Man 3, but it really lent itself to some really cool alternate universe takes. Hopefully in the multiverse, I'll be able to watch some other versions of Iron Man 3.
Gordon, how about you?
So if you watch MCU movies for what's essential for the forward moving plot of this huge behemoth series, Iron Man 3 is among the least essential. Because again, as we talked about here, you can get pieces of it in other places for Iron Man's character arc. And we even get, the ending of that arc in Endgame. So if that's what you want, and for some people, that is the most important thing. Yeah, I think Iron Man 3, you don't need to see in that regard. Now, as Cy brought up, if you like Shane Black movies, if you want to kind of see Iron Man stripped of a lot of his stuff, if you want to see a cool Ben Kingsley performance, and kind of think about, Iron Man kind of figuring out he's got the Iron Man inside him all along. I think this movie is very good for those aspects. And so I certainly recommend watching it. I will not watch it again in the next couple of days, like Sai seems to be suggesting. That seems excessive to me. But I do think it's worth watching. And if you're thinking about Iron Man in particular, this is a worthwhile movie to do. It's not the most important continuity movie. It's got its issues, but it's a lot of fun overall to my mind.
Yeah, I've definitely softened on the movie, and I think a big part of that is thanks to Shang-Chi and what they've done with the Mandarin concept, and with also Ben Kingsley as a performance too. And I really like the relationships in the movie. You know, I think the Rhodey and the Tony stuff is the far away probably my favorite part of the movie is that relationship. But as far as, you know, like you guys said, as far as like being like an essential part of like the MCU, a lot of these same story beats are hit in other movies. A lot of the same character beats we get in other forms, and in some respects you could argue better. I certainly think so. But and also the Shane Black of it all, it's still a little too overpowering for my taste. As much as I like him, I wish this would have been an Iron Man movie first and a Shane Black movie second, but it ended up kind of being the opposite. And I think, Sai, you're right. I really would have liked to see like an Iron Man 4, and especially like you mentioned the Ghost. I mean, that is like, I'm amazed that, because that would have been a perfect adversary for Tony in the MCU, because the Ghost in the comics is a corporate saboteur, and that would have been such a really cool thing, a cool take on the character, because that's, especially in this world we're living in now, that's a character that would be very appealing to a lot of people too. So you could actually have a lot of, he could have very much been like almost like kind of Tony's version of Killmonger, in that, he's someone who's, yeah, he's a bad guy, but he's making some good points. And I think that would have been really interesting to see, because we never really got that Tony challenged on that level. It's always been, he's being challenged constantly by other corporate guys. So, and when you have him up against a worse corporate guy, Tony ends up looking better by comparison. But if you have him up against a guy who's anti-corporate, I think it would have been a much more nuanced take on the characters.
My pitch for Iron Man 4, Tony Stark, Squirrel Girl together. See that dynamic.
There you go.
Squirrel Girl comic has some pretty funny Iron Man stuff in it. If you haven't read that stuff, it's pretty delightful. I'd love to see Tony paired with somebody just completely different with perspective, that really isn't affected by the Tony charm in that same way, or the Tony I'm paying your bills perspective. I think that'd be fascinating to see, honestly. In a movie.
That's what I loved about him interacting with Cumberbatch in Infinity War, and it kind of made me wish we could have seen like a Doctor Strange Iron Man team up movie. Okay, guys, this has been a fun conversation. I wasn't sure what to expect from this going into it when you guys pitched me the email, but this has been a lot of fun. Thanks so much for coming on, and please go ahead and tell people one more time about your book, about anything else you want to promote.
Sure. Well, the book is called Leaders Assemble: Leadership in the MCU, and you can get it anywhere books are sold. And we're really proud of it and really happy to be here. When we talked about this and we heard that you didn't like Iron Man 3, I was a little concerned about where the conversation would go, but this has been so much fun.
Yeah. So definitely check out the book. We're both online. Feel free to check us out online as well. We don't talk about superheroes all the time with our professional accounts, but we've been talking about it quite a bit lately, and so we'd be happy to talk to anybody else about this. We love these movies, we love the comics, and we enjoy our field too and sharing about it. So
yeah, this is such a fun conversation. Thanks again for coming on. Really interesting discussions. I wasn't sure where the conversations have gone, but they've gone in some really interesting areas that I could not have predicted. So if you guys ever want to come back again, definitely let me know. But as for us, that does it for this episode of Superhero Cinephiles. Website is superherocinephiles.com. Super Cinema Pod on Twitter and Instagram, and Superhero Cinephiles on Facebook. Please make sure to like us, give us a review on Apple Podcasts. anywhere you get your shows. And if you want to support the show, you can do so through Patreon. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. You have been listening to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Super Cinema Pod. Join our Facebook group by searching for Superhero Cinephiles, where you can interact with us and other superhero fans. If you'd like to support the show, you can become a regular supporter at Patreon or make a one-time donation through PayPal, both of which can be found at our website, superherocinephiles.com. If you buy or rent any movies through the Amazon links at our site, it helps support the show. Please be sure to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening. And as always, good night, good evening. God bless.